We have here from Madrid, Spain, Father James Alison, who has agreed kindly to share with us his memories of Professor René Girard and how Professor Girard made an impact on his life and how they met. So I'd like to start off by asking you, Father Alison, how did you first hear about René Girard, and what drew you to him? How did that start?
Okay, I think the first time I heard of René Girard that I remember was in 1984, when I was just recently finished my novitiate with the Dominicans, and one of the teachers of the Dominicans at Blackfriars, Professor Fergus Kerr, very distinguished philosopher, just happened to mention Girard. He was himself writing a book called Theology After Wittgenstein, and he gave us one of the examples of what theology would look like in a new non-mentalist, non-Cartesian world, the thought of this Frenchman called René Girard, and he just mentioned it. It was like a page en passant, and I was one of the proofreaders for his books, so that was where I first read it. And then about 3 weeks later, I read an article in New Blackfriars by a Dutch Dominican about ecology. And the article about ecology also quoted the importance of this French thinker, René Girard. And I was struck by the coincidence. I thought, how weird. Here is this same person being quoted by two people, both of them Dominicans, but with entirely different fields in mind. What is it that this man must have in order to be able to throw light in such different fields? So I asked Fergus Kerr if he had a copy of one of Girard's books, and I think I'm right in saying he lent me The Scapegoat. And so I started reading that, and then one of my other teachers went to Paris for the weekend, and so I asked him to buy me the Livre de Poche edition of Things Hidden, because that was really quite cheap, which he did. And I then fell ill with the flu, and while I had the flu, I read this book. And it was during this time that it was as if I had been read by the book. So I thought, oh dear Lord, here is someone who has told me everything that I have ever done, like the woman at the well of Samaria. So thereafter, I knew that there was a truth teller at work here, someone who was telling me the truth about me and about lots of things.
Can you elaborate on that? How did you figure that out? I mean, Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World is quite a complicated book. It has different sections: anthropology,
I guess, yes,
and then the individual psychology. So
I think that it was the collection of all of them together. It was the realization that I think maybe it was a mystical realization that there was a whole single idea here, and that it made sense of Christianity, it made sense of the Bible, it made sense of me, and it was going to be worth unpacking for a very, very long time, as it has been. That was in 1984, so now I'm talking 36 years later.
Right.
And so, yeah, from then on, I read everything I could of his. I read Violence and Sacred, and that even more confirmed that this was something so big. And I then started to be able to read the Bible again for the first time in a long time. Having been brought up in an evangelical Protestant background, the Bible had been simultaneously terrifying and boring.
Right.
But with René, it started to come alive, as though the inner spirit with which it was written was suddenly opening itself up in its interpretation. So these were very, very exciting times. So that was, if you like, how I first came across him. The next question, if you like, the next question that you posed me is when I first met him. Is it okay to move on to that?
Absolutely, absolutely, sure.
So that happened in this way. I managed to get myself sent to do my theological studies as part of priestly formation to Brazil. And before I left for Brazil, I thought, well, I must write to Professor Girard to see if he has any colleagues who are working on his thought in Brazil, where I'm going to study, in case I can meet up with them. So I wrote him a fan letter to say how grateful I was to him for everything he had done, and asked him whether he had any colleagues in Brazil. Rather to my amazement, I got a handwritten letter back in that particularly special style of his, which meant that the further he got down the page, the more the writing went up the side of the page, which is a curious feature of his. His lines started quite flat, but then they gradually got more and more curved up the side. And he's saying, no, that he didn't have any colleagues in Brazil, but that his colleague Jean-Pierre Dupuy had spent time in Brazil. His wife was Brazilian, and recommending that if I had a chance, I should get in touch with him. Well, of course, I didn't know Jean-Pierre at that time. I went and did my studies in Brazil. And then, just as I was finishing my studies in 1990, I found myself suddenly invited to a meeting with the theologians of liberation and René Girard in Piracicaba. It was the first time that René came to Brazil. And the backstory to this meeting was that the liberation theologians were beginning to realize that their paradigm for dealing with victims was perhaps a little inflexible. After all, the Berlin Wall had just come down. It was clear that whole ways of thinking were going to be reinvented. And Hugo Assmann, by chance, had bumped into Girard at a conference, I think in Buffalo, or somewhere in, maybe it was Baltimore, but somewhere in the United States, and realized that here was something new that was compatible with, but not the same as, their approach. So he invited him. And they then reached around to see if there was anybody who had read Girard's thought amongst them locally. And either Girard told them, or one of my professors told them, that I was a great Girard reader and follower and had been reading his stuff. So I found myself invited, scarcely out of undergraduate school, to this meeting in June 1990. And I was absolutely terrified of meeting René, because I'd been reading him at this stage for 6-7 years.
Right.
And, as a good Englishman, we assume that French intellectuals are enormously grand people of very great arrogance and self-importance,
right,
and very unlikely to take fools, treat fools kindly.
Right.
So I was just terrified that after having absorbed everything he'd written, I was going to meet the man and be flicked aside like a mosquito, a dead mosquito from a tabletop. Right. I could not have been more wrong, as you know.
How old were you at that point?
This was 1990, I was 31.
You were pretty young.
I'm glad, yes, I suppose 31 is fairly young, yeah.
That's amazing. Okay.
I was 31. I'd been ordained a priest since 1988, so I was a couple of years a priest. Okay. I just finished my theology degree, but I hadn't yet embarked on the doctorate. But so there I was at this meeting. Yes, certainly one of the youngest people at the meeting. Right. Actually, there was another young Korean Brazilian student who has also gone on to develop René's thought in Brazil a good deal. But yes, but apart from anything else, René couldn't have been more gracious, friendly, delighted to be there. He made me feel at ease. Martha, of course, was wonderful, also made me feel at ease. I remember her spectacles collapsing, and so I was able to go out with her to find an optician where we could get little screws to mend her glasses. But René, the whole meeting was extraordinary, because this was a meeting with liberation theologians who, the principal bad guys in the liberation theologians are European thinkers and North American politics, these being different forms of imperialism, as you can imagine. So at the meeting, it had been agreed that they would talk in French, that the whole meeting would take place in French, that being René's language, because of course no one wanted to admit that they could speak English, even if they could, because that was the language of imperialism. It became clear very quickly that their French wasn't up to
the liberation theologists, essentially.
yes, their French wasn't, in most cases, their French wasn't sufficiently competent for them to be able to actually talk in French. And given that there was a mixture both of Portuguese speaking and Spanish speaking amongst them, they very quickly kind of settled to the lowest common denomination of speaking in Spanish and René answering in French. Now, it was absolutely, as an outsider, a semi-outsider really, being a young whippersnapper, who, as it happens, spoke all the languages, Spanish, French, Portuguese, and English. I was able to witness something which was, to me, was absolutely extraordinary, which was them asking questions in Spanish and René answering immediately in French, having listened and understood the questions in a language which was by no means one that he dominated well. He could read it, but he was not a Spanish speaker. And in every case, answering the question exactly on point, absolutely to the center of the question as posed. And not only that, answering it in such a way that they came away feeling not only heard, but more intelligent than some of their questions were. I mean, there was an extraordinary exercise in grace.
Fantastic. So he understood Spanish without a problem.
He understood it without a problem. He answered in French, but his French was, I mean, you know, as I understand both languages. I can tell you, he answered straight to the heart of every question he'd been put in Spanish without an or an or a, please could you repeat that, I don't understand it. But what's amazing about that was that this was at that stage, I don't know, a 60-something-year-old man. It is extraordinarily tiring to listen to and concentrate on listening to a language that you don't dominate,
right,
and then to reply, even if replying in your own language. And yet he did not appear at all tired. And as I say, everyone came away feeling more intelligent, more appreciated than any of us had any right to feel. So it was an enormous privilege. And I'm glad to say that Leonardo Boff, at the end, who himself could be a fairly susceptible figure on issues of, you know, Europeans and Yankees and things like that, thanked him for the sanctity of his intellect, which was a very appropriate response to what they had all felt of this amazing thing. So, you know, I had the privilege of getting to know him well, being able to do a little bit of translation for him and for Martha in the more social hours and things, and feeling thoroughly on board and liked and part of the party. And so later, when I sent to him the draft of my master's thesis, he treated me as an old friend, and ever since then, you know, I went and stayed, and so on and so forth. And so I was treated basically as part of the family from then on.
Right.
So that was my sense of meeting him and why.
Was he also part of your dissertation, doctorate committee?
Well, obviously, my dissertation was about him. He wasn't one of the examiners for it, but it was about him, or about his thought, and he was very pleased with it. And it was because of it that he introduced me to Jean-Michel Gourguignon and others, and invited me to come to Stanford. So for the second COV&R meeting in 1991, he got Stanford to pay for my ticket to go from England to attend that. So then I got to meet the whole crowd and started to make friends with them, and those friends have stuck ever since then. I've hung out with Andrew McKenna, with Jean-Pierre Dupuis, with Wolfgang Palava, Jim Williams, Cesario Bandera, all of them since then.
All those Girardians.
All of those Girardians. I found my club, if you like, and a wonderful Gil Bailey, a wonderful, wonderful club it is, and just in terms of the friendliness and the non-clinginess and the good relationships and the mutual sharing. It's very remarkable. It's a very remarkable intellectual scene.
So, Father Alison, let me ask you this. In all these years that you knew him, both as a person as well as a scholar, what would you say was the biggest impact he had on your life? on your personal life?
Gosh.
Because intellectually, of course, he was an intellectual giant and he revolutionized everyone intellectually.
But I think that he only really he only really revolutionizes intellectually those whom he revolutionizes at a level of desire as well. Because I think that his thought is an insight about desire rather than an intellectual scheme. So I think he produced huge changes in my life. If I were to say the most important at level of conversion, it's that he set me free entirely over a long period of several years of reading him and listening to him and trying to apply him and praying his thought. He set me free from any sense of being a victim. I was able to completely see through my own participation in victimary games. And that was probably the greatest liberation in terms of conversion that one can have. The gospel becomes possible when you are not the center of the world and when you are not a victim. Jesus is the victim, and he is that generously and deliberately so as to enable people like me and others not to have to even be survivors any longer, but to be sons and daughters of God, which is something entirely different. So that for me is the most, the longest term and the deepest. But also at an intellectual level, he basically made Christianity bearable by undoing the penal substitution theory of the atonement and making it possible to understand Jesus going to his death as being something for us rather than as some sort of ghastly payment to God. So he completely undid the thoroughly moralistic and emotionally blackmailing structure of the center of Christianity and the way I had been brought up, and made it possible for Christianity to come alive as something that is grace rather than emotionally blackmail. And that has continued to be something that I've been living with and trying to work out and trying to say more of ever since. Where else? Well, I mentioned also the question of the Bible. He made it possible for the Bible actually to become a place of excitement and revelation rather than a place of dread and punishment. And then again, I think that simply learning from him the importance of the one central insight, which is we desire according to the desire of another, which makes us all secondary and not primary. We are not self-starters. We are other-started. And this is not some sort of defect of a romantic protagonist. This is the condition of possibility of coming to life. In other words, there is a basic humility. And it's taken me a long time for me to sink into that. But those, I think, are the three absolutely fundamental areas. And of course, every other element of my life has been a mixture of those. So is that helpful?
Absolutely. There's quite a big, profound impact in every way.
Oh, absolutely.
Essentially. So you had multiple conversions as a result of Girard.
Yes, or one long single conversion in which I hope I still am.
We're still going through, right?
Oh gosh, yes.
So let me ask you this. Girard had a very phenomenal career as an intellectual. He started with Deceit, Desire, and the novel. And then Violence of the Sacred, and then Being Hidden Since the Foundation of the World. And then lo and behold, last time I met him, he was going to write a book on St. Paul. He was talking about writing a book on St. Paul. And lo and behold, came about Battling to the End, which
I then said, yes.
At the beginning of it, he said, I'm going to write the most apocalyptic book that I've ever written. So it's caused a lot of controversies. And what do you make of the last book that he's written, Battling to the End? Does he give a solution to this battling to the end?
Oh, no, I don't think he wants to give a solution. I think that he wants to make explicit the fault lines. show how it works. No, I think that in that sense, it's a non-Hegelian account of history. There isn't a built-in solution at the beginning. I find it very difficult, and I had to work out, both to give a lecture and for myself, what is meant by hope, because he doesn't talk much about hope. Strangely, the book, I think, is infused with hope, because I think it's only a person who has hope who can allow himself to see the truth of things in such a dark way. Normally, if we're optimistic, it means we don't dare to look at the muck.
Yeah.
But if you have hope, you dare to look at the muck because you're not frightened by it or scandalized by it. So that was my sense with him. He was daring to look at the potential awfulness of things in the face without being dominated by that. So that's my sense of it. But I'm honest with you. It's a very difficult book to understand. A lot of the central part of it, which is to do with Franco-German relations, is
right.
Outside my sphere of
Sure.
of expertise, and something I'm not really able to comment on.
Right.
But in a sense that it reminded me how brave you need to be for hope to become visible as that which is moving you, even when you're not talking about it. That was how I read it. But it's a book that I will probably have to read again to understand better. Since then, I've
still struggling with it myself as well. I'm still going through it very slowly, struggling with it as well. So it is a very difficult book. Out of all of his book, I find it's very difficult.
Very difficult, and of course, part of it is that you can't tell sometimes where it's him genuinely being difficult and where it's Benoit taking him in certain directions, which is fine. Any book with an interview would be of that sort.
Right.
Since that, I've tried to do, I spent quite a lot of time reading the Book of Revelation, which of course René scarcely touches on. And I think it's very important to bring out the different sense of what is meant by the word apocalyptic, as used in modern sociological speak and as used in ancient theological speak. So that was something which I felt, if you like, pushed in two directions by that last book. One is to work out a mimetic understanding of the virtue of hope, and the other is to do a Girardian reading of the Book of the Apocalypse.
Is that what you're doing?
Well, no, I actually posted it online. It's quite a long essay. Just before COVID started, actually, it's become quite it's quite useful to read our reactions to COVID alongside it. But yes, but I think that, this was the thing which he did, and it's what a really great thinker does. He doesn't close off avenues of research. He forges deeper paths that we must then dare to see if we can furrow as well. And he opens up things for us to do. So I feel like I've never felt constrained by being someone who ought to interpret René. I've always felt liberated by René's thought into take this and run with it, see what you can make of it. I think that he would not be interested in having people who try to justify his thought. I think that he would be very interested in people who understood his idea and see whether they could apply it in new spheres. So that's what I've been trying to do.
Which one of his books is your favorite? From Deceit, Desire, and a Novel all the way to Battling to the End. Do you have a favorite one?
The one that I read most often for reasons of personal piety is his little one on Dostoevsky, Du double à l'unité. But I think if the one that I most recommend to people as a starter is The Scapegoat. I just think it's so elegantly done. I mean, it's each one of the chapters on the myths, and then each one of the chapters on the Gospels are just so lucid and glorious. Absolute. each one definitive. So yeah, I would say that. The others, I mean, Violence in the Sacred is, you have to read and reread, and it's astounding. But in terms of immediate favorites, those two, Dostoevsky for a retreat, and The Scapegoat to introduce anybody to his thought.
So you actually take people on retreat with the Dostoevsky book?
No, I take it on when I go on retreat. Oh no, it's an exercise in self-criticism. It's what he helps make possible in self-criticism that is there.
Okay. So in closing, let me ask you, Father Alison, in all these years, can you recollect some of your best memories you had with him?
Yes, I mean, a couple come to mind. One, we were at a meeting somewhere, and I can't remember where. It may have been somewhere in France, or it may have been in America. And the talk that was going on was frankly boring. And so I rather naughtily went out of the stadium and went outside and started smoking a cigarette. And surprise, surprise, René snuck out also and came and asked me for a cigarette. But making sure Martha wasn't there to see him. And there was just something so lovingly unpretentious and complicit and just fun about that. And then there was another occasion, which I remember with great pleasure, and this was quite late in his life. So 2008, I was staying with them in Palo Alto, and there had been some kind of meeting, but on the last evening, almost everyone else had gone away, but I was still there. And so René and Martha took me out to dinner, just a little bit up the hill in a kind of a farmer's market restaurant. You probably know it. It was one of their regular pitches. And we fell to talking about recent films we had seen, and because Martha was very keen on, I forgot the name of the film now. It's got something, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, or something, which she was very keen on. But recently there had been the film No Country for Old Men.
Yes.
I think it's a Cormac McCarthy
yeah.
Novel. And I had seen it because everybody had said that it was a must. But I had been rather shocked and surprised because it had kind of ended not at an end. It hadn't ended properly. It some stopped, and it was just baffling. And so I just said rather naively, as it were, not stopping to think I was in front of the greatest literature professor in the known universe. I said, I didn't really like it because I like stories that have ends. And he said to me, you know, James, I think you're right. I do like stories that have ends. And it was just, I thought afterwards, oh my God, I didn't realize the weight of that conversation until afterwards. But it was just so gloriously unthreatening and unpretentious. So yeah, those would be two of my favorites, of many glorious and well, just such deep gratitude.
He was always very humble. He was very humble,
approachable, not at all self-obsessed.
It was amazing.
Yeah. No, it's true. It was amazing that somebody of that greatness could have been as completely unassuming as he was.
To be honest with you, he came the closest, for me, he came the closest to Jesus in real life. He was a good shepherd.
Yes.
He was humble and full of truth.
He was humble and full of truth, and he had genuine care for his protégés, and he didn't. He wasn't at all pompous or dismissive about people who were not up to his level.
Right.
What more can you ask?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Father Alison, for taking your time and sharing your thoughts and your.
It's my very great pleasure. There is
I hope to see you soon in person.
Indeed, when travel starts up again. Yes.
Soon, absolutely. Okay.
Okay. Thanks very much.